All right. Well, while you're turning there again, John chapter 20. Every once in a while, you get asked a question that can radically change the course of your life, depending on how you answer it. I actually asked on social media this week, what are some of the most important questions you've ever been asked? And people gave a lot of good suggestions. Probably the one people gave most often was when they had someone get down on one knee in front of them and simply asked this, will you marry me? Maybe you think back to the first time you asked someone on a date. Maybe when you're sitting down in an interview room or with someone who's trying to help you figure out the future and they ask a question like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? What do you want to do with the rest of your life? How many kids do you want to have? That how we answer those questions really shapes what our life looks like, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. Some questions have less to do with our future, but they can be just as profound. A friend reaching out during a dark time and simply asking, are you okay? How are you doing? Maybe a phone call from someone who hurt you in the past uttering this question, will you forgive me? Questions that were asked can have a profound impact on our lives. And in our text this morning, John chapter 20, verses 11 to 18, a woman is asked a question that not only changes her life, but changes the course of human history. And it's a question that all of us have to consider today. And so as we turn to John 20, before we get to verses 11 to 18, I want to back up and start in verse 1 to lead us into our story that we're going to read. So John chapter 20, verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. If you're unfamiliar with the story, a woman named Mary is coming to the tomb of Jesus, and Mark's gospel tells us her and at least one other woman were coming to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus. They were coming to pay their respects to Jesus, who had passed away just a few days before. Now, from what we know of the relationship that Mary and Jesus had, this would have been an incredibly painful moment in her life. As she dealt with the death of Jesus, she'd be in a pretty dark place at this point. Luke gives us some details in his gospel about Jesus' relationship to Mary that we don't get in the Gospel of John. And in Luke 8, 1-2, we read these words. Soon afterward, he went on through the cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God, and there were 12 with him. And also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. And so eventually Mary travels with Jesus as he preaches, and she helps support his ministry. And Luke says that part of the reason Mary was with Jesus was because he had driven 7 demons out of her. Now maybe that 7 is a literal 7 demons that had been driven out, but often in Scripture the number 7 gives us an idea of completeness, totality. That in essence Luke may have been telling us Mary was completely possessed by demons. She was very possessed by demons. And not only that, but church tradition tells us that Mary was also likely a prostitute. And so given her condition and her profession, she's someone who really had been pushed to the fringes of society. That for lack of a better term, she was an outcast in her world. With everything that she was dealing with everything that was known about her, there were few people who wanted anything to do with Mary Magdalene. And yet Jesus shows up and he radically changes Mary's life forever. He casts the demons out that had possessed her. He invites her to follow him, and she begins to play this important role in his life and ministry, and someone who had been kept at arm's length by everyone else around her was given by Jesus her health and her sanity, new relationships, a renewed purpose, value, and identity. Jesus had given all of this to Mary when all hope seemed lost. And now Jesus, this man who had meant so much to Mary, not just her, but all of his followers, was gone. And you can imagine the grief that they were beginning to feel. Maybe that helps you understand a little bit better how painful the death of Jesus would have been to those closest to him. And so you can imagine her surprise when she shows up at the tomb that morning and the stone has been rolled away. And now for those of us on the other side of the story, a little bit of a spoiler alert here. It's been 2,000 years. You've had time to catch up on the story. But we see the empty tomb and think this is great news. Jesus is risen. But that's not what Mary was thinking when she discovered the scene. We look in verse 2 and see what she thought. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they laid him." Mary's reaction is she doesn't think Jesus has risen from the dead. She thinks someone's stolen the body. Maybe the religious leaders took it. Maybe political leaders took it. Maybe it was something as simple as grave robbers taking the body. That whatever the case, this would have been incredibly upsetting to the followers of Jesus, that even in the midst of their grief over the death of Jesus, now Jesus isn't even getting a proper, respectable burial, and just the pain of who would mess with a dead body that's already been put in a tomb. Now, as soon as Mary tells these other disciples, Peter being one, and the disciple whom Jesus loved, which when you read that in the Gospel of John, that's the Apostle John, they run to the tomb, and when they get there, they begin to investigate. And here's what they discover. John chapter 20, verses 6 to 8. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and saw the cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. Now Peter gets to the tomb and discovers that Jesus is gone, and he notices that the cloths that had wrapped Jesus' body had been folded up and placed separately. And if someone had come to steal a body, it would be odd for them to take the time to do housekeeping around the tomb. It seems like they would want to take the body and get out of there as quick as they possibly can. And they're seeing these things, and they're trying to figure out what happened. And all of a sudden in verse 8, the light bulb goes off for the Apostle John. Now, he didn't yet understand the full implications of everything that had happened, but in that moment, John knew Jesus has risen from the dead. Now, I want to stop just for a second at this point and think about the incredible gift that the Gospel of John is. In this book, the book that we're in this morning, we have eyewitness testimony from one of Jesus' 3 closest friends during his public ministry. And around 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, John sits down and he begins to tell us what he's seen and what he's heard and what he experienced. And he tells us, when I looked into the tomb on that morning, this is what I saw, and this is what I knew to be true. Now, John sees the empty tomb and believes, but that still isn't the reaction that Mary has to what's happened. She finally makes it back to the tomb. People are going back and forth on this morning trying to figure out what's happened. It's unlikely she's talked to Peter and John again at this point. And in verse 11, we find Mary again, still confused, still heartbroken, still weeping over what's happened. Verse 11, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stopped to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him." Now Mary looks into the tomb, and all of a sudden she's confronted by 2 angels, and they simply have one question for Mary. And it's a question she's going to hear a couple times over the course of the next few minutes, hours, however long the scene played out. Why are you weeping? That's what the angels want to know. And Mary's response is, someone's taken the body of Jesus, and I don't know where it is. And so Mary has now seen an empty tomb. She's talking to angels, and it hasn't quite clicked yet what has happened. And if those 2 pieces of evidence can't help her figure it out, maybe what happens next will open her eyes to what's happened. Verse 14. Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Now, at this point, it feels like it's just getting a little silly. We're reading the story like you might watch a movie where you know what's coming, but the main character doesn't. How often have you found yourself yelling at the TV because you knew something was coming that someone playing out this story couldn't see? How often have you yelled at the TV for someone not to go back into the house, not to walk through the woods in the middle of the night because you know that something bad is about to happen? And that kind of happens as we read the story here. It should be so obvious. Why can't she see it? She's seen the empty tomb. She's talked to angels. She's having a conversation with Jesus at this point. Why can't she see that he's risen? And yet, for whatever reason, she doesn't see it. And part of the reason might not have been her fault. Throughout the Bible, we have at least 11 separate stories where Jesus appears to various people after he's risen from the dead. This, John 20, this is the first instance where Jesus appeared to someone after he had risen. And we find that in these stories, for some reason, the appearance of Jesus has changed enough. He's not usually recognizable at first. Something has changed about his body post-resurrection that makes it difficult for people to perceive what they're seeing. Or maybe it's not that. It's just simply this. Mary wasn't expecting the dead man to stand in front of her and have a conversation with her. Again, at this point, no one's seen the resurrected Jesus. Mary has the privilege of being the first person in human history to see Jesus risen from the dead. And as you can imagine, it's likely she's just not thinking this was a possibility. I think this speaks to something important we need to remember. When we look back on these stories, we're tempted to think that we're just so much smarter and more advanced than people who lived in the first century. You know, maybe these people way back then believed that someone could raise from the dead, but we know better now. And however, for all the intellectual advancements we've made in 2,000 years, in the first century, people still knew once someone died, they stayed dead. This is not rocket science they had to figure out. N.T. Wright, in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is one of the most comprehensive defenses of the resurrection ever written, stresses this point that those who were living in the first century, including the Jews, they did not expect or believe that someone would raise from the dead during the course of human history. They might have had hope that at the end of all things, people would rise. At the end of all things, maybe we would come back to life. But there wasn't this hope that once someone died in the here and now, during the normal course of human history, that they would raise on their own. It just wasn't something they expected to happen. This makes sense of the fact that throughout the Gospels, Jesus repeatedly tells his disciples, I'm going to die, and I'm going to raise from the dead. I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be put to death, and then 3 days later, I will rise. And he tells his followers this over and over and over again. But how do the disciples respond once Jesus has died? They're filled with grief. They hide because they're fearful of the authorities. They're left wondering, what are we going to do now? Because even though Jesus told them he would rise, there's no expectation that someone's going to raise from the dead once they have died. And we see that this wasn't an expectation that the followers of Jesus had. Now, Mary's had an eventful morning. She's seen the empty tomb. She's seen angels. She's talking to Jesus. You can understand how things would be a little confusing at this point. And she's still assuming at this point that someone has taken the body. And notice what Jesus asks her initially. It's the same question the angels asked Mary just a few seconds ago. Woman. That sounds harsh to us, but the first century ma'am. Okay, she wouldn't have heard it the same way we do. Woman. Why are you weeping? This feels like, just say this, on the surface this seems like a pretty stupid question, and it's probably wrong to say Jesus asked a stupid question on Easter morning, but it seems like a pretty self-evident question. Of course Mary should be weeping right now. This feels like when I do something wrong at home and I say something I shouldn't have and I upset my wife or I hurt her, and rather than simply apologize, I have to lead off with the question, honey, what's wrong? And we both know what's wrong, and it's not a mystery. And you would think it wouldn't be a mystery why Mary's crying here, because one of the most important people in her life has just died, why wouldn't she be crying in a moment like this? And yet the more time you spend with this question, you slowly begin to realize Jesus isn't looking for information here. Jesus knows what's happened. Jesus is beginning to press Mary a little bit. Jesus is challenging her with this question. Jesus is trying to change the way she's looking at the world. In essence, Jesus is asking her this: Mary, I've risen from the dead. Why are you weeping? If Jesus is risen, that changes everything. And this is something Jesus understands far better than Mary at this point in the story. Not only it changes everything, it especially changes the way that we look at the world around us. That if Jesus is risen, how can we weep? If Jesus is risen, then death, our final great enemy, has been defeated. Why are you weeping? Why are we weeping? Now, I want to be clear about what Jesus is saying here. He's not saying there's no room for grief in the Christian life. He's not saying that because Jesus has risen from the dead, then Christians just go around happy all the time regardless of what's happening in their life. Think about a story from Jesus' own life in the Gospel of John, just a few chapters before this. John chapter 11, Jesus goes to a funeral. His good friend Lazarus has passed away. And as Jesus spends time with the family, and as Jesus thinks about the loss of his good friend Lazarus, Jesus weeps, knowing he's about to raise him from the dead. Jesus is overcome with sorrow in that moment. Jesus weeps in the Gospel of John. Jesus knew what it was like to experience pain and grief in this life. Jesus has risen, but Christians still have bad days, and it's okay to hurt when those days come. But Jesus asked Mary, why are you weeping? Because even when life is difficult, if Jesus is risen, we are never without hope. If Jesus is risen, then we'll face trials and troubles in this life. But they will never win in the end, because we know how this story ends. If Jesus is risen, our greatest enemy has been defeated. We all face troubles in this life, and some of us will deal with more trouble than others. However, at the end of the day, there is one great enemy that all of us must face, one great trial coming for every single person who has ever lived. And regardless of who you are, your income, your education, your degrees, your employment, your family reputation, your relationships, whatever it is that gives you meaning and purpose and value in this life, we will all face death. It's as we hear in the song "Wait for It" from the musical Hamilton. Death doesn't discriminate between the sinners and the saints. It takes and it takes and it takes. And I wish I could see into all of the living rooms right now who began singing that song. As I started to read through those lyrics, my daughter Jordan loves the soundtrack, and she probably just started singing it. And honey, we'll sing it. Just let Daddy finish preaching real quick wherever you're sitting in the room right now. But it's true. Death is inevitable. We do everything we can to try and forget it. We keep ourselves busy. We keep ourselves entertained. We try and stay as distracted as we possibly can, but life has this way of shaking us out of this bubble we create around ourselves. A loved one passes and death becomes a present reality. A global pandemic arises, and all of a sudden all of humanity is faced with its own mortality. And in those moments when the prospect of death creeps in, it forces us to grapple with some difficult questions. Is there life after this, or do we simply live and die? Have I made the most of the time that I've had on this earth? Is there a God? And if there is a God, what is he like and what does he want from me? Those questions that keep you up in the middle of the night, that press in, they become more real as we consider death, as we're confronted with death. And if we're being honest, it feels like we have few assurances or control over questions like that. And if you allow yourself to think about these hard things, not just death, but the pain and the suffering that we see around us, which seems more present now in light of what we're facing. When we think about the pain and suffering in the world, it can feel like this unbearable weight that begins to crush us. It can be overwhelming. Where can we possibly find hope? Should we try and just make our lives as convenient and comfortable as possible for the time that we have here? Is that all that there is to this? And yet Jesus comes to us in these moments when we're hurting, when we're joyless, when we're overwhelmed, just like he came to Mary. And he asks us the same question he asked to her. Why are you weeping? Don't you know that I've risen? Theologian Herman Ritterboss writes of this question, why are you weeping? This is the question posed again and again from the perspective of the resurrection. To those who in their grief and uncertainty still judge everything from the perspective of death. We can control a lot of what happens in this life. We can overcome plenty of challenges. We're people who like to make things happen, who like to figure out solutions to the problems we're facing, and yet on our own, there's nothing we can do about death. It seems like this insurmountable foe. And yet something happened. The resurrection becomes this moment in human history that allows someone like the Apostle Paul to look at something as formidable as death and write these words in 1 Corinthians 15, "O death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting?" How could someone say such a thing? Say something like this? They must not have ever lost someone close to them, and that's not the case at all. Paul can write these words because the resurrection of Jesus accomplished for us what we could never pull off on our own, and it's why we celebrate today. It's why we worship today. It's why we wake up with a smile on our face on Easter morning, because through the death and resurrection of Jesus, our greatest enemy has already been defeated. So how does Mary respond to this question that Jesus asks? Well, we read, supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I'll take him away." And again, as you read through John 20, this story starts to drive you nuts. Why can't she see it? Empty tomb, angels, Jesus talking to her, you think would be a pretty good clue. Why can't she see what has happened this morning? She can't see it for whatever reason, and then something happens. Jesus speaks to her. Jesus says to her in verse 16, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabbi," which means teacher. And as soon as Jesus said Mary's name, her eyes were opened. Jesus is risen. And it's the best news she could ever hear. This scene harkens back to something Jesus said in John 10 when he told his disciples that he was the good shepherd. And he said of himself, that shepherd who would care for us as sheep in verse 3, "The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out." It's easy to be frustrated with Mary in this story. But honestly, there's plenty of times when we don't see the resurrection of Jesus either. We don't see Jesus clearly. Where we don't see the beauty and truth of what he's done. We might believe it as an idea, but we're so prone to forget how it should change our everyday lives. And there's a reason it's hard to see. One, we've got so much else going on. We're distracted. We're too consumed with other things. But underneath all of that, our sin and our disobedience and our rebellion against God didn't simply separate us from God. It also blinded us to the truth and the beauty of who God is. That in a very real sense, our sin, our disobedience put a veil over our face where we could not see Jesus for who he was anymore. Our heart wants so many other things. And yet, in the midst of that, in the midst of our searching for something in this life, looking for something that we know that is out there that would satisfy us, but we can't seem to put our fingers on it, these moments come when Jesus speaks. And we don't deserve it, but the Good Shepherd utters our name, Mary. And for whatever reason, by the grace of God, He shakes us out of our confusion. He shakes us out of all of our searching. He wakes us up to who we are and to who He is and to what He's done for us, and the veil falls from our faces and we see Him. And we see the resurrection of Jesus, and we see the grace of God, and we begin to understand what the resurrection of Jesus means for us. In those moments when Jesus is speaking directly to you, and maybe He's doing it right now through His Word, through this story that the Apostle John has given us, He's calling you in the same way that He called Mary to follow Him, to wake up, to pay attention, to listen to these things, because Jesus has done something for you and for me that we can find nowhere else. If Jesus is risen, it means the penalty for our sins has been paid. And in our disobedience to God and our rebellion against God, we rightly deserve the judgment and wrath of God. Left to ourselves, we don't deserve anything other than punishment from God. And yet 2,000 years ago, Jesus comes to earth, and He goes to a cross, and He dies in our place for our sin. He takes our disobedience on Himself, our guilt on Himself, our shame on Himself, and on the cross He bears the wrath of God in our place that we should have faced. And the resurrection is God's seal of approval that the penalty for sins has been paid. That the debt that we can never pay back to God has been paid. That God has accepted that sacrifice of Jesus. And now if we will believe in that resurrection, our sins can be forgiven. And the resurrection also means that there's more to life than the 70 or 80 years we hopefully have on this earth. That there's life beyond this, and the resurrection of Jesus guarantees it. And if Jesus has been raised, then we will be raised too, and death will not have the final word. We will experience pain in this life, but the resurrection means we never lose hope, because something better is always coming. No matter what you're going through, Jesus will make all things new. And the resurrection guarantees it. Jesus will make us new. And the resurrection is His promise of that. A few years ago, Rick Warren, the well-known pastor of Saddleback Church and the author of The Purpose-Driven Life, together with his wife Kay, went through a devastating loss when their 27-year-old son Matthew took his own life after battling depression and mental illness for years. About a year after the tragedy, Rich said, "I've often been asked, how have you made it? How have you kept going in the midst of all your pain? And I've often replied, the answer is Easter." You see, the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus happened over 3 days. Friday was the day of suffering and pain and agony. Saturday was the day of doubt and confusion and misery. But Easter, that Sunday, was the day of hope and joy and victory. And here's the fact of life. You will face these 3 days over and over and over again in your lifetime. And when you do, you'll find yourself asking, as I did, 3 fundamental questions. Number 1, what do I do in my days of pain? How do I get through my days of doubt and confusion? And finally, how do I get to the days of joy and victory? And Warren closes with these words. The answer is Easter. The answer is always Easter. Again, that doesn't mean they didn't grieve the loss of their son, but they never lost hope that a day was coming when Jesus would make all things new, and it's an incredible and powerful hope that we're given. We will still hurt. But we can never lose hope because Jesus is risen. So what does that leave for us to do? Look at me with verse 18. Mary Magdalene went and announced to his disciples, "I have seen the Lord." The greatest announcement. Mary Magdalene, the first person to see the risen Jesus. What a privilege that would be. And to go and tell the disciples, after all the pain of the previous 3 days, "I have seen the Lord." Mary saw the resurrected Jesus and she believed, and it changed everything. Not just her life, all of human history. What are you going to do with the resurrection of Jesus? Mary was posed with that question, and we're posed with that question this morning. For some of us, like Mary, Jesus is calling our name today, and he's trying to get our attention. Listen, look, believe, see me. See what I've done for you. See the hope and the joy that you can have in me. If Christ has been raised, that means you can be raised too. You can have hope now and in the future, that you can be made right with God solely because of what Jesus accomplished for you by his death and his resurrection. You can be made right with God in this moment, right now. The debt for sins has been paid. God has accepted the sacrifice. Forgiveness of sins is available. All that's left for you to do is to believe, not clean yourself up, not figure enough things out, not get to a place in life where you can earn it. Jesus stands ready and willing to give you right now forgiveness and grace and hope and a new life with God and hope for the future. And all you have to do is believe, is to look and listen and believe these things that we celebrate today. And maybe you're sitting there in your living room or wherever you are right now and thinking, but that can't be true of someone like me. I think part of the reason Jesus chose to show himself first to Mary was because if Jesus could offer this to someone like Mary, he can offer it to someone like you. And we find great comfort in that. For others of us, Jesus wants to challenge us this morning with the same question he challenged Mary with. Why are you weeping? We are living in difficult days, and it's understandable that most of us are experiencing anxiety and fear and uncertainty about health, our finances, the future. Things just seem out of control right now. And it should grieve us to see pain and suffering around us, but even as we grieve, we cannot lose hope. We know how the story ends, and we know that one day God will make all things new, and he's powerfully at work in us right now. The resurrection of Jesus guarantees it. And so if that's true, Jesus comes to you today and asks this question: why are you weeping? Don't you see the hope that you have? Don't you see the hope that we all have? Tim Keller writes these words: when my wife was growing up, every summer her family spent 2 weeks at a small compound of cottages on the shores of Lake Erie. Now the cottages are all gone. In fact, that part of the beach is gone. Whenever she visits that childhood vacation spot, she weeps because she knows the beach is irretrievable. That sense of irretrievability is like a death. And the older we all get, the more we realize that certain losses are irretrievable. They're gone. And that sucks the joy out of our lives. But here's where Christ's resurrection offers something unique. Even religions that promise a kind of spiritual future or spiritual bliss only offer consolation for what you've lost. But the resurrection of Christ even promises the restoration of what you've lost. You don't just get your body back, you get the body you always wanted but you never had. You don't just get your life back, you get the life that you always wanted that you never had. But Jesus Christ is walking proof that you will miss nothing. You will miss nothing. It's all coming in the future. It's going to be unimaginably wonderful. There's no religion, no philosophy, no human being who can offer you this kind of future. And as Christians, our hope for the future is based on the historical fact of the resurrection. So if you're not a Christian, let me ask, why wouldn't you want that? Even if you don't like different aspects of the Christian faith, why wouldn't you want this hope for restoration? You're not being honest with yourself if you don't want that. If Jesus is risen, then everything has changed. And everything will be restored. And everything that is broken will be made new. And even though we might hurt in this life, we can never weep. Because Jesus has risen. I'm going to pray and we'll sing. Father, thank you for this morning. Jesus, thank you for raising from the dead, for the hope that you give. Comfort us now. Set our eyes on you. Help us see you ruling and reigning, risen. And God, I pray that it would change everything about how we experience the world around us. Give us a renewed sense of hope and peace and comfort. Give us a renewed vision for you and the things of God, that we might walk through these uncertain days with an unshakable hope in the good things you have done for us and will do for us. Father, may we never lose hope. Jesus, thank you for loving us and saving us, and we ask this all in your Son's name. Amen. In just a second, Cody and Cassie are going to come and lead us in worship, and as we sing and celebrate what Jesus has done, there's a few ways you can worship this morning. One, we do this every Sunday. We gather. It's called communion, and this is a remembrance of the death of Jesus on the cross for our sin. And so we invite you wherever you are, if you have some bread and some juice or some wine, to set it aside. Maybe hit pause on this and get the things ready. And whenever you're ready during the course of this worship set, if you're a follower of Jesus, to share in communion, to remember Jesus' death on the cross for you, but also to remember the hope of the resurrection that we have. If you're a part of City of God, we encourage you to give. It's part of your worship today, and up in the right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a button there that says Giving, and so you can click there to give. We would also love to pray with you this morning. There are people who are ready and willing to pray with you right now, and below your screen there should be a request prayer button. You can push that, and someone will come and pray with you right now. But I'm so excited to have this opportunity now to sing and to worship and to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus with you. I look forward to seeing you again in person, hopefully soon. I love you. I love this church. And I'm so thankful to get to walk with you through this life as we learn what it means to be followers of Jesus who don't lose hope because Jesus has been raised from the dead.